Good morning and welcome everybody to our Working Well Remotely webinar series. We will give everyone another minute or so to join us in our virtual auditorium and start the show. All right, we will get started. Welcome everybody to Creating Resilience in the Workplace. My name is Pamela James. I am the Executive Director for Campus HR, and we've been hosting these Tuesday morning webinars. This is our 7th week out of 8, this series, and we had a series last fall as well of 7 different weeks. All of these webinars are being recorded and available. The slides and the recordings are available on our website, which we will put in the chat box shortly. So if you missed it, a previous topic, or you want to refresh yourself on one that you attended or want to share it with a colleague, feel free to do so. We're excited that we're getting such great attendance at these. These are clearly important topics. Here we are 1 year into almost to the day of working remotely. So building resilience is certainly an important topic. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a webinar format versus a Zoom meeting. Therefore, while you can see us, the panelists, we can't see you. So we communicate via the Q&A box versus the chat box. So our format will be that we will have 30 minutes of the speaker content, and then we will open it up for about 20 minutes of Q&A. And so feel free during this session to submit your questions. We'll monitor those, and after our speaker has finished, we'll get to as many of those questions as possible today. So let's get on with the show. I am really pleased to introduce a cabinet member, a senior leader at UCI, Dr. Willie Banks. He's our Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. So Willie, we'd love you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and why you think this topic is important to you personally.
Well, thank you, Pamela, for the invitation to host this webinar, and thank you to HR for all of their work and really trying to connect with all of our employees out there. I am Willie Banks, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, and I have the pleasure and honor of leading the Division of Student Affairs here at UCI. And we're really focused on the out-of-classroom experience for our students. So everything from residence life to student organizations to health and wellness. We cover it all, and we want to make sure that our students are successful. Equally as important is making sure that our employees within the division feel connected to the institution and have a say and a stake in the work that they're doing. And so this topic is quite important for everyone, especially in times of COVID. We all have to really work on resiliency skills. It's quite easy to sort of fall into a little slump because it has been a difficult year. And I think that is probably one of the lessons that I have learned this past year. This has been tough for everyone all around. And so any help that we can get to learn more about ourselves and other people and to help our work will be beneficial. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's joining us this afternoon or this morning, and also to Pamela for the invitation to host this event. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move to our introduction to our speaker, because he has some great things to share with us and has some great slides. So Vibhas Ratanjee, and my apologies, Vibhas, I just ruined your last name, so my apologies, is a subject matter expert, speaker, and author with Gallup. And Vibhas is based in Gallup's Irvine office and specializes in executive level engagement strategies and facilitates Gallup's consulting programs. He's an executive coach and a leadership consultant. Oh, excuse me. I lost my screen, my apologies. And a leadership consultant to senior executives and CEOs. Vibhas also specializes in performance management and has been a key researcher and integral advisor on the topic for Gallup. So we're going to turn it over to Vibhas and let him take it away. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Willie, for the kind introduction. And I'm really delighted to be back doing another webinar for UCI. I think I did one last year. And today, I think talking about a really important topic, I'll talk about creating resilience and well-being in the workplace. And like Pamela mentioned, a topic that's, I'm sure, is extremely important given the year we've had. So what I really want to do in about 30 minutes or so is kind of talk about two things. One, how can you really focus on resilience for yourself? So I'll give you 5 areas that you can really be focused on in terms of resiliency at an individual level. And then I'll shift to kind of some ideas around what you can do to build resiliency for others. I mean, some of you as managers and leaders, it's equally important that you actually focus on and invest in building that level of energy and resiliency for others. So some very focused kind of ideas and actions is what we'll talk about. Well, first, I mean, Gallup, we've been doing a lot of research in this area of resiliency and burnout and so on. So I just wanted to give you kind of a overview of what we've found. And what we found is really well-being is plummeting and worry and stress has spiked to unprecedented levels in 2020. In fact, the percent of thriving Americans dropped to a 12-year low in 2020, in fact, down to Great Recession levels. So a couple of things that we're seeing here. One, the percent of thrivings, as I mentioned, dropped down. The percent of stress and worry, that spiked up, unprecedented magnitude. Specifically, when we look at our research, it's one of the key areas around finances. So as kind of financial situations have worsened. And perhaps most critically, many people we surveyed said that their mental health will suffer before the physical and financial health does. And there's much that has contributed to that, including the fear of illness and social isolation. Hopefully things are getting a little better now, but a recent CDC study found kind of a tripling of anxiety symptoms and a quadrupling of depression compared to 2019. As a result, and not surprisingly, our research shows that 76% of people have experienced a great deal or fair amount of disruption. Now, when you think about resilience, that just makes it all the more important, especially when you talk about alleviating burnout, helping employees cope with stress, bouncing back from illness and hardship. But when we talk about stress and burnout, it's not just unique to 2020. In fact, even our research pre-pandemic showed that more than 70% of employees have faced some form of burnout even before the pandemic. So the importance for resiliency, like Willie mentioned, all the more important. So before we get into kind of enhancing resilience and what that means, I think it's important to kind of define what we mean by being resilient. What is resiliency? So I'm going to share with you a definition, which I really like. Psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stresses. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. I love this definition for the reason that it's not just talking about kind of the deficit-based view of resilience and the significant stress that people are focusing on and experiencing, but really as an opportunity for personal growth. So if you really think about these experiences that we've had in 2020, they're crucibles for growth. It's not just the adverse experience, but how you react to these events that will define you. More than the event, I think it's, like I mentioned, learning to cope with loss, drawing meaning from that event, learning and growing from that, that's key. According to another study, there's an American Institute of Stress, by the way. Yes, there is an American Institute of Stress. 77% of Americans experience psychological symptoms of stress. Could be stress, could be chronic stress or distress. So again, the importance of resilience is there, but how do you deal with the stress? How do you reduce the impact of that stress on ourselves, on our families, our coworkers? That's what we need to really be talking about. I want to make one point about resiliency because sometimes it gets mistaken with mental toughness, like how mentally tough you are. There's a big difference. Resiliency is what helps people recover from a setback. Mental toughness is what can help people avoid experiencing a setback in the first place. So there's a big difference between the two. But there is something that you can do about building resiliency, even in times of adverse change. But first, here's what I want you to do. If you have a piece of paper and pen, I want you to kind of think about how resilient you're feeling right now. I've got 4 options there. I'm doing very well, hanging in there, mostly good days. Definitely feeling the weight and effects of COVID, and I'm worried about me. And I'm not going to ask you to share these, but just write it down. Because as you do that, just the act of acknowledging how you feel is important. It's the first step. And as you do that, and as I go through some of these examples, some of these actions, some of these tactics, think about what fits for you in terms of what you can individualize as your approach to building resilience. Because one thing this 2020 has shown us is that life doesn't come with a map or a manual, but it kind of comes with a compass, kind of a wayfinder. You just need it to be pointed in the right direction. So what's the answer to how you can thrive in life, in work, with your family? How can your life be pointed in the right direction is what we'll talk about. Now, Gallup done a lot of research in this area. In fact, we did a massive study covering about 98% of the world's population to uncover that truth. And we found that navigating life and living a life well lived, there are 5 very important elements that I'll talk through. The first element is physical. And that's the one that gets the most attention. If you have the energy to get things done. The second element is community. Do you like where you live? The third is career. Do you like what you do every day? Here's the fourth one, social. So it's meaningful connections and friendships that you have in your life. And the final one is financial. How well are you managing your money? As I mentioned, financial stress is a big part of what we've experienced in 2020. So as you kind of look at these 5, this is a much more holistic way of looking at resilience. Think of this as a compass. It's kind of your inner GPS. We know that when you have these pointed in the right direction, all of them, you're more resilient. You bounce back from hardship and suffering much better. In fact, our research shows that you need kind of all these elements of well-being working together. And that's what creates a difference. So if you think about that wheel, if any one of them is not in place, if you're struggling in any one of those aspects, then life will not move well. So I think these are kind of important areas. Not just that, we've actually seen some serious connection between higher perceptions of well-being around these 5 and a range of social and psychological resilience outcomes as well. Here's what we found out. So the focus, as I mentioned, has to be on all these 5 elements, and I'll talk through each of those and give you some ideas there, not just on 1 or 2. So compared with employers who are just physically fit, focus on just physical fitness or physical well-being, we see that those who have high well-being across all 5 elements they stay longer with an organization, they miss less work as a result of poor health, they're 43% more likely to be volunteers, they're likely to be better citizens, and they're 36% more likely to report a full recovery after illness, injury, or hardship. So one of the points I really want you to be focused on is think of resilience not only from a physical point of view, but also from all the other elements of well-being that are equally important. So essentially what we're saying here is when you think about thriving in those 5 elements, those 5 well-being elements, that's the key to resilience. It's about how you're recharging those 5 key elements. It's about not just being an empty or vague concept, resilience, but it's ultimately a set of skills that can be taught. So, and that's what I'll talk about. What is it that you can do? What are the specific things that you can do and intentionally do to focus on well-being and build resilience? So let me go through each of these, the 5 elements. And as I share them, you'll see that they're very specific tactics or actions you can take according to our research that creates an impact on that particular element of well-being. Let's start with the career well-being part. Here's some best practices, and here's the first one. Use your strengths every day. There's a lot of research that shows that a positive view of yourself and confidence in your abilities and your strengths is the key to resilience. And of course, the key to kind of personal success as well as professional success. In fact, Gallup's research shows that those individuals who know their strengths compared to those who do not are more likely to have an excellent quality of life. So really know your strengths. That's the first big action area. The second, identify someone with a shared mission. Find someone who shares your feelings, shares your sense of mission and contribution. Now, that could be a best friend at work. It could be an individual that you can learn from. And spend more time with that individual overall. In fact, to extend that to others, opt in to more social time with people you enjoy being around. Spend quality time with those you enjoy being around, but also those that can add value to your life. And again, there's a lot of research on this. You mirror the habits of the people you spend the most time with. So to build good habits, spend more time with people who already practice them. And this is actually called the social proximity effect. The opposite is also true. So spending time with people who drain you, who sap your energy, will have the opposite effect. So at work and in your personal lives, choose who you want to be around. That we've seen as a big element that drives career well-being overall, is who you spend time with at work. Now it's kind of challenging because you're not in one place. You're working remotely. Some of you might be working remotely. Some of you might not. You still be on site, but still making time for those connections with your colleagues who add value to your life and to your career is an important one. So I'd almost ask you to kind of, a piece of paper, write down to 2 to 3 names you think are individuals that you really want to be spending more time with in 2021, and stick to that. Is the second one around social well-being, and it's an important one. Do you have supportive relationships, and do you have love in your life? The first one is reimagine how you invest your time. I saw this interesting research yesterday that the average person turns to their phones 150 times every day. So you just do the math there. If every distraction took only 1 minute, obviously it's more when we get on our devices, that will account for about 2.5 hours of every day. That's 2.5 hours every day that you could invest in something meaningful with friends, families, or colleagues. So that's one, reimagine how you're investing your time, reprioritize some of that. The second one is strengthen your network. Think about who you turn to for ideas, for information. Who do you turn to when you're facing a crisis? Write down those names, identify those support systems, and really let them be there for you. I mentioned this earlier in the previous slide about connecting with people who add value to your life. So connecting with these more empathetic and understanding people can remind you that you're not alone in terms of adversity and difficulty. It will really strengthen your resilience. And the last one here on this particular element is mix social time with physical activity. A great way of maximizing both your social well-being as well as your physical well-being is to kind of mix social time with exercise and physical activity and so on. That's known to actually create resilience as well. Financial well-being. So that's an interesting one. I mentioned that's a cause for worry, according to our research with a lot of Americans. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about money. Not something generally people like to talk about, but there are ways in which you can positively impact your economic life as well. So I'll give you a few ideas here. The first one is establish methods and systems that can help you reduce daily worry about money. So whether that's creating a spending plan or a debt management plan, all these are kind of intentional ways you continue to focus on well-being without financial worry kind of taking over your life. So essentially kind of establish a more healthy relationship with money by planning, by focusing on it very proactively. The second one we found out was a surprising one, which is help others with their worry. And there's a lot of neurological research that has shown that when you help others, our brain releases oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine that can significantly impact your own resilience. So sometimes when you're helping others, you're helping yourself. And in fact, it's called the helper's high when you're actually helping others. And it doesn't have to necessarily be monetary. There's a lot of non-monetary, non-material help that you can provide, like emotional support to others. So think about who you can help. That will impact your own financial well-being as well. Here's an interesting one. Buy experiences, because experiences last and material purchases fade away. And when you buy experiences instead of things, you're investing in what's called memory capital. And when you share those experiences with family or loved ones, those experiences are worth their weight in gold. So when you think about 2021, what are the experiences that you're going to be investing in for yourself and for your family? That's going to be as important. Let's go to kind of physical well-being. Again, a big focus in 2020, good health habits like getting sufficient sleep or nutrition and exercise, maintaining good personal hygiene, all those are kind of non-brainers. But here's what research is showing us. Getting at least 20 minutes of physical activity each day, that's non-negotiable. Sleeping, that's another one. That's also incredibly important. There are other ways you can do this, whether it's some of you might want to do practice mindfulness or yoga or meditation. All that is all good. But whatever you choose to do, stay consistent and stick to it. That's important. The second one here, spend enough time in kind of the recovery zone outside of what's called the performance zone. So we spend most of our time at work, especially in front of computers of those of you working remotely. And we spend a lot of time in the performance zone. In fact, there's recent research that shows that the hours that we're working remotely, that's gone up by about 2.5 hours. We're working more. But there's a lot more, right? There's doing chores, there's taking care of kids and all of that. So we spend a little time in the recovery zone when we're sleeping. And I think sleeping is essential, but that's not the recovery zone. It has to be downtime. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that a lack of recovery period is holding back your ability to be resilient. There's some estimates that this actually costs the economy about $62 billion in lost productivity a year. So thinking about that is important, and being disciplined about what you need to do to create that, stay more in that recovery zone, and being intentional about it is important. Here's a really important one when it comes to physical well-being. Avoid overwhelming negative news. Last year in 2020, there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of news about what was going on and so on. In fact, our own research at Gallup has shown that during the pandemic, the attention to news was higher than right after 9/11. So bringing more positivity in your life by staying away from negativity, having a recovery zone, and putting your time and effort into building resilience from a physical point of view, beyond everything that you need to do around exercise and physical well-being, it's critical. It's the community well-being one. Again, there were fewer opportunities to be out there in the community helping, but here are some ideas that might help. First, identify what you can do to contribute. But when you do that, align that to your own sense of personal issue. So you can pick an issue or a community or a social need that you might be passionate about, but think of that as a mission or a goal for yourself personally, and then plan for it. Have a personal contribution clearly there. Here's the other one. Tell people about your passions and interests. Share how you can contribute. And it's a great way to connect with others as well. It's a great way of investing in your own well-being and the well-being of the community. The last one here around community is kind of opting into a community group or an event that typically tends to be important. Whether you want to start small or go big, you need to start. That's the key. I think this is an element that's perhaps the most overlooked out of the 5 that we've studied. And it does create a fantastic impact on resilience overall. And by doing small things, I remember the American Red Cross blood drive. They had a campaign line was something like, give blood, all you will feel is good. So, small things in investing in community well-being is really investing in your own kind of mental well-being and your resilience overall. So think about how you can actually do that. Now, these are ideas which are backed by research. These are backed by science, that they're backed by Gallup's own review of well-being. I'm putting them up here on a slide, all of them. So the idea is not to do everything. The idea is to prioritize. And again, you got your piece of paper. As you kind of review these, I want you to pick maybe 1 or 2 areas of well-being. Maybe you pick up career, maybe you pick up financial. And then within that, if you could just, and we'll send you these slides, but if you were to kind of highlight a few things that you'd want to be doing, you'd commit to doing over next year, I think that would be a good one. But let me kind of give you a broad plan around how you can go about creating this plan around resilience or a plan around well-being, because ultimately your well-being is your responsibility. So here's a plan to get you going as you plan 2020. Kind of follow this path. First, you determine your current state. Those 5 elements that we talked about, which are the ones that you really want to be focused on? Which are the ones that you think you're thriving on? which are the ones you might be struggling on. Kind of at least acknowledge that and write that down. And then really envision your future state. For each of those elements of well-being that I talked about, visualize what that might look like in the future. What does thriving look like? What are the things that are happening? In fact, a great way to do this is to just visualize yourself 2 years from now, thriving in each of those 5 elements that I talked about. What is it that you're doing that's made a difference? So it's kind of looking and envisioning a little bit. So look at that a little bit. How does it feel? And then that gives you a really good opportunity to start identifying gaps that kind of fall between the current and the future states. Where do you have the largest gaps? Is it your financial well-being? Is it physical well-being, and so on? What are the barriers that are preventing you from achieving your goals? What kind of support do you need, and who do you need support from? And what are your next steps? The point here is to have some very simple action steps. Write them down and share them to create visibility and accountability. Writing it down is incredibly important because, again, there's a lot of research that shows what you write down, you do. So incredibly important that you kind of start putting together a plan. Excellent. So what about the well-being of those that you manage? So I'm going to take you through a few key ideas here around how you can manage well-being for other individuals that you either manage or you work with. And I'll give you 10 kind of ideas. I'll run through them one after the other. Hopefully that gives you kind of a good view. Here's the first part and the first way you can drive well-being of others. The first one is ask employees to contribute well-being ideas. And I think with the Working Well movement at UCI, what are some ways in which people want to be focused on in terms of their own well-being? Those ideas are critical. Solicit ideas on how to enhance well-being both at work and at home. So when you do have those conversations, you need to personalize that focus on well-being and resilience. What are the ways in which employees can actually practice that well-being, not just at work, but also in their unique situations at home? And then, of course, an important part, once you've done that, is get feedback. What's working, where there's room to improvement. And resilience and well-being, like I mentioned, is not just about working on multiple well-being and support initiatives. It's about making these initiatives work for people. And the only way you can do that is by individualizing some of those well-being initiatives. Here's the second one, linking the well-being of each employee to the successful mission or purpose of the organization. And the mission of UCI is around 3 imperatives, I understand: research, education, and public service. So as you kind of think about that, how does kind of a vibrant well-being culture help you connect, help you achieve some of those critical mission success factors, whether it's research, education, or public service? Ask how a mission might help them lead a life well lived. And this is where people will personalize that mission around what they want. So personalizing the purpose of the organization is important. And the final one here, constantly remind others of these connections. Keep communicating those connections between individual well-being and organizational purpose. Encourage well-being activities when setting job expectations and goals. This is a great way of actually starting to say, hey, even in a review meeting that you're doing or an annual goal setting, when you look at all those career goals and so on, what's your well-being goal? Add that as an element of conversation. So, and let employees choose the well-being activities that is best suited to them. I talked about individualization earlier. So that what best suits you and your unique talents and your interests. So it's not just a menu of well-being initiatives and you're picking one off each other, but you're personalizing again that well-being initiatives. Remind employees what programs and offerings are available. In many cases, we've seen that employees might not know the breadth of things that are available to them. Is in terms of just the next one, have each employee identify the element of well-being they feel comes naturally to them, at which they're most successful. And then those natural kind of connection to well-being is an important one. You can only do that through conversation. So you can invite employees in either one-on-one or small group meetings and describe all the elements of well-being and see what people gravitate towards. You'll see in your team of 5 or 6, somebody might say, hey, I'm really focused on physical well-being. And somebody else might say, I want to have a community impact. So rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach, have more individualization around each of these well-being elements for different members of your team. And think about it in a larger context. There's some great questions you can ask to understand the context of well-being or the need for well-being at an individual level. So for example, asking a question like, what do you value most in your life? What do you value the most in your work, in your families? Tell me about a high point experience where you thought that you were thriving. What does that look like? Having those individual connections is key to having a personalized investment in the well-being of those you lead. The fifth one here, I'd say this is the most crucial one, recognition. When you see well-being in action, recognize. So recognize people for well-being success. Almost kind of create that mechanism where that happens. Now, this could be for physical well-being, like maybe weight loss or somebody beating a chronic disease or some contribution that someone's done to community. Make that part of your huddles, make that part of your overall conversations, whether at an individual level or at a team level. And I think here's the thing, this will impact not only well-being, but it'll also impact engagement and how engaged employees feel at work. Just another tip here, ensure that your recognition efforts are well-rounded. That means that you are actually taking all the 5 well-being elements we talked about, and you have specific recognition for each community or social and physical, even financial success that people have had. For example, investing in a house, that's financial well-being. Recognize people for having taken that step towards higher resilience and higher well-being. As we kind of round off the next 5, this is number 6, always follow up. I did say earlier that well-being is a responsibility for every individual, but your role as a leader is to follow up to ensure that people are focusing on well-being. So have employees submit their interests and goals for well-being in the beginning of the year. When you're doing goal settings, like I mentioned, then you regularly check in on how they're progressing on their well-being goals. Are there any barriers that you can help remove for them? Have they picked up the right well-being goals? Do they need to change their well-being goals in 6 months and so on? That kind of conversation is important. As appropriate, you can also inquire about the well-being of family members. And that's important because you're thinking about, you're respecting the individual for who they are and their family circumstances rather than just as an employee. So in fact, the well-being of their families include those in the goals that the individual has for their overall well-being. This is what will make well-being truly inclusive. You're kind of focusing on the whole person, not just the person you see every day at work, but their family and their larger circumstances as well. All right, this is a great idea. I've got one myself, a well-being board of directors. What I mean by that is you actually have employees identify at least 3 people at work who've had a significant impact on their well-being, and have a conversation on how and why and what they need to do more to kind of keep investing in that individual. And then really encourage employees to write a note to each of those individuals who have invested in meaningful ways to their well-being, describing how they made that contribution and describing what more they can expect from them. This is a great way of recognizing those who are well-being champions and actively kind of focusing on the well-being of others as well. Here's the 8th one here. I think this is an important one. As you start building up more examples of well-being best practices around the 5, when you're interacting with team meetings, have people share what they did, what made that successful, what can be learned from it. So it's almost like sharing best practices, not just within your team, can open that up to other teams that you work with at UCI as well. So there's always a conversation around what are the various ways in which you can really positively impact well-being. Here's another one, ask employees to share apps they've discovered or books they've read that support their well-being, almost like a well-being book club, if you may, so that there's more communication and conversation around things that are working, like a mindfulness app like Calm, for example, or others, or a book that you've read. I think those are other interesting ways. Explicitly link each workplace well-being activity at least to one of the 5 elements. But there's so many things that you're doing at UCI working well. Can you kind of individualize those activities that are UCI supported when discussing the goals? So when you're having conversations around goals, you can tie it in to an individual intervention. And then communicate the value and benefit of these activities. Do that consistently. I mentioned this, you need to encourage participation. You need to encourage utilization of all those initiatives that you have already in place. So they need to track progress. Here's the final one. I'm going to wrap that up soon and open up for conversations. I mentioned goal setting. actually include well-being goals and milestones in review and progress meeting. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can either incorporate the 5 elements of well-being into a progress review conversation at the end of the year, looking back. What did you do? You said you'll focus on community well-being and physical well-being. What are some of the specific, meaningful ways that you made that progress? And once you've done that, have those discussions on a regular basis. Is there an aspect of your well-being that I can support as a manager or a leader? So I know there's a lot here. There are 5 kind of areas that you can focus on. There's some very specific tactics that you can. And again, this is right there in terms of those 10 big ideas. As you kind of do that, I'd say the next step really would be think of which of those 5 elements are important for you for 2021. Have a plan around what you'll focus on. Where are the largest gaps? And then as a second step, focus on how do I create well-being for others, for other managers and for other leaders, for other team members, even for other customers and patients that you're working with. How can I create a greater focus on any one of those 5 dimensions? So you've got those 10. I would say as a next step, have that plan. And I'm going to share the screen again. Current state, future state, what are the gaps? And then determine simple action steps for yourself and for those you manage. So that's what Gallup research at least has shown in terms of what are some of the meaningful ways and you can enhance resilience. Follow kind of a path, build a plan, and then follow up. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and open it up for questions.
Vibhas, such a great job and great presentation. I have to commend you for actually including in your slide deck all of the appropriate, all of your images had people with the plexiglass and the face covering. So, I mean, kudos to you and Gallup for getting those images together. So I just want to say kudos to you. We have a few questions.
Sure.
So I'll go ahead and ask one. Most of what you discussed is about well-being generally. Can you make the specific connection to resilience? Which activities does Gallup or others show increases stress, resilience, or growth in stress?
I mentioned this, it's the combination of the 5 that actually does. You know, I think resilience is an outcome, how I feel. What you invest in is your well-being. And you do that in a multifaceted way. And that's the point. You're not just investing in one. So our research shows that there's higher resilience, what we call bounce back, essentially bouncing back from adversity. There's higher a proportion of that when you're actually focused on all 5. So well-being is the compass, it's the path towards resilience. And resilience is an outcome. So you don't really you're not planning to be more resilient. You're investing in different parts of your life in a holistic way so that you create an outcome like resilience.
Well, that makes sense. You know, one of the things that I think is so hard during these times is that we're doing all of these things virtually. And I know that one of the slides you talked about was finding community and finding time with people. How do you do that in this type of environment where there are lots of restrictions on, from COVID as far as trying to build community in person with each other? So do you have any tips for folks to think about?
Yeah, I think being meaningfully investing in a few, there's so much that can be done. And there's so many examples of clients we're working with who did a lot of fundraising, for example, before COVID. In fact, I have one client, which is a hospital system on the West Coast, who did a lot of fundraising based on walks that they did. Now, you can't do that now, last year, but they still managed to do it. They still managed to actually have a virtual walkathon. Oh. No walking involved, but all the same, getting people together and having a conversation, connecting with people, talking about the purpose of the organization. And what was really interesting was that they were able to actually raise more money than they did in the one-on-one interaction. So that's the point. It's the need for connection is greater, actually. It's not less, it's actually greater. And I would say actually the demand for these kind of community activities, even though it's virtual, is even more. I mean, we're stuck in Zoom meetings all day. Some of you will work at home. You need that you need that break. And that creates a lot more emotional connection than others. So I say, how can you kind of repurpose or translate something that you did pre-pandemic to a virtual environment? There are a lot of examples of how people are being able to do that still.
Yeah. Well, Vibhas, I feel like we could probably do an entire session on just Zoom fatigue, because I know that Zoom fatigue for for lots of us is very real. I have another question for you. As a leader, how can you check in on the well-being of an employee without possibly invading their privacy?
That's an interesting question. I think we sometimes our default these days to just get on a Zoom meeting, and we don't leverage a phone call, for instance, because sometimes there's a lot of research recently that's showing that part of the Zoom fatigue is kind of seeing yourself, like we are seeing right now, because that you're seeing yourself day in and day out. That's actually creating almost an identity crisis, if you may. If you can do something just with a phone call, do that, because that's a personal connection. It's not like I got a Zoom meeting, then I got a personal check-in. Do a phone call if you can, or have a Zoom room. I know leaders who have a Zoom room from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and they say anybody can come in and have a personal conversation. So these are some ways in which you can do it. But unfortunately, it's kind of an occupational hazard for a lot of us to be on Zoom. But there are other ways in which you can connect through phone or wherever possible. I think more and more now, hopefully, as we see signs of hope, more and more one-on-one meetings, even though they're socially distanced.
Yeah. So it's really about the meaningful time and finding the right people that you want to spend time with, and not expending your energy on people that are taking your energy away instead of giving you energy. So, okay, that's something for us to think about. I have another question for you. How do I know if I'm resilient?
I talked about the current state and the future state. I think you need to go through those 5 elements and give yourself a score. Let's say 1 to 5, where 5 is I am thriving and 1 is I'm struggling. Just do that for yourself. Do that objectively. So, and if you were to add up those numbers, you get an average score, actually. You might find out that I actually reviewed the 5, and I thought I was really struggling on physical, but I'm really struggling on community, because I don't think I feel like I'm doing anything meaningful in terms of contribution or social, and I think that provides you with an indication on where the gaps are. And as you kind of work on those gaps in a meaningful, intentional way, you will know that. At the end of the year, give yourself a score again. How did you do on each of those 5? Now, if you find out that on 2 I did okay, on 3 I didn't, you're not resilient. I mean, our research tells us that you can be resilient when you have a holistic focus on all 5. Any one of them broken, I mentioned it's a wheel, right? Any one of them broken, the wheel's not going to move forward.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been such a great presentation, and I'm going to throw it back over to Pamela and thank both of you for the opportunity to join this webinar, and thank you so much. So Pamela, back to you.
Great. Really appreciate your participation, Dr. Banks. Really thank you for being the host today. And then also, Vibhas, great content, really helpful to have those worksheets, which we will get out to people in another day or so. So really appreciate the content. Thank you so much. What I'm showing here right now is our last week of the webinars, and financial well-being was one of the aspects that Vibhas talked about today. Well, if you want to know more about that, next week we'll have someone from Fidelity, plus a couple cabinet members, Brian Hervey and Peter Schneider, as the co-host next week. So feel free to join us next week. And then also, don't forget, this is the whole series here, all 8 topics. So if you missed one, you can go to our website again, and we have the recordings and the links to the PowerPoints. So look forward to seeing all of you again next week, and feel free to leverage all of our content that is already available. Thank you everybody for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye everyone.